Hey everyone. One of the cool things about Savage Worlds as a system is there's so many really awesome settings that are available, and a lot of those settings have a thing called a plot point campaign. Now, plot point campaigns are pretty cool, and they give you GM a lot of ideas on how to create a long story arc within the system. But you know what? I just do them different.
So roll. It's a savage world. Strange as a weird war. It's a savage world.
Hey everyone, it's Carl with Tabletop Tango. Look at the bubbles, do the stuff. Really would appreciate that. Any support, send some email, whatever. We also have a podcast called Mastering the RPG, and that's at masteringtherepg.com. And that's general cool stuff, all about gaming with a couple of friends of mine, including a professional DM. So, cool stuff. Anyway, so let's talk about plot point campaign. So what really is a plot point campaign? So as I said, a lot of settings come with what they call plot point campaigns and Savage Tales. A plot point campaign is a series of stories or adventures that have an overall arc to them, just like any other campaign. And what's a little bit different in Savage Worlds than maybe in a D&D where the book is thick and it's got all the adventures laid out and it's got very detailed stat blocks and descriptions and things like that. Most plot point campaigns really just kind of each adventure gives you a framework. It might be just a couple of pages to describe the scenario, what's going on, what the players might encounter, some of the things they might do, and then kind of the stats for some of the key NPCs or creatures or whatever you might be running into. And that's great. But I have a problem a little bit with the plot point campaign as they're sort of written, because they're often requiring players to do things, expect them to do things to keep moving the story forward, which isn't unusual. That's sort of the linear adventure thing. But since plot points are supposed to be weaved into a campaign, because normally they're not, again, every adventure you're going to run, they are a set. And then you weave in your own adventures, you weave in Savage Tales, and that sort of thing. And so I take a different approach because I want to let the players have agency, and they might want to wander off in a different area or do something different. And then that changes whether you can get them to go through that plot point campaign the way you want. So what do? I use them as a framework. I use them as inspiration to say, here's where the story needs to go, or here's where the adventure kind of leads to. And right now I'm running the plot point campaign from Deadlands Lost Colony, and that's exactly what I'm doing, right? I won't give spoilers away, but there's a big deal that's coming from Earth that's impacting the planet as a whole, and there's a set of stories that lead up to that. Now, some of them assume players have, like, spaceships. And that's just not what I wanted to do. I wanted to have them more planet bound and have that resource, really live on Banshee, because Banshee is now kind of more like the Old West than a high-tech area. And I wanted them to experience that and build from that. So I couldn't use the plot point campaign as is, but I could take the idea of what's supposed to happen and I can bring that to the table with my own spin on it. And as the players do things and I react to those things, I can bring in NPCs based on their backstory. Like one of the characters has a kind of a person who's looking for him because they cheated him in cards, or they were going after their girlfriend, something like that. And so now that NPC can become one of the NPCs in the adventure, or they're a driving force to make the players take choices, make strong word, but incentivize them to make choices that keep them going with respect to the story. For example, they need to work with Hellstrom Industries on something, and my players were like, I don't know if I want to do that. I just want to trade, and I want to travel the planet, and I want to do that, and I'm trying to fix up this vehicle that I found, which is great. But that couple of NPCs they weaved in her backstory kind of pushed them in a direction that they wanted to make that choice because they needed the money, they needed to get out of Dodge for a while, and so that was pretty cool. So the story elements I use as inspiration. Savage Tales are cool. I take those as inspiration too and weave them in. But in the end of the day, probably 50% of the content is driven by how the players react to those story elements. And I may have to take a roundabout way to get there. They may go through multiple adventures. I may have to layer something on. And then ultimately that leads to finishing what they needed to do. For example, again, in the Lost Colony, they need to try to destroy something that a creature on the planet, the skinnies. They need to go destroy something with respect to the skinnies. And the plot point campaign has you're going to meet this person, and this person's going to tell you everything. But this person's like, who are they? Why do they matter? So I had to, through a series of adventures, start creating somebody who matters. It's actually somebody they hated initially, but then they find out that this person is kind of turned over a new leaf. They want to do what's right, and they have something that they need to do the job. They have a weapon, and one of the things the players did was have to bring down a piece of this weapon before they realized that this was potentially a bad guy. And so that's like 4 sessions just to get from the one plot point concept to this other one, with some great tying in. The plot point campaign says after they do this thing, they're going to go and this guy's going to tell them to do a thing, and they're going to do a thing. Okay. Not a lot of motivation. The hope is the players are just going to want to do that. So plot points as a pure play, I don't do. So what do I do, right? I mentioned some of that. So first thing I do is I read the plot point campaign completely. Seems to make sense. But and what I'm doing is I'm writing down or internalizing, if I don't write them down, sort of the key aspects. What are the things that each one of these adventures is trying to move forward? Is it trying to get you closer to the bad guy? Is it bringing in an NPC that's going to be important later? What is each one of these trying to do? Next, I look at those interesting NPCs and I say, do these potentially link to the backstory of the player characters that were defined? Can one of those NPCs be that? Can one of those NPCs be related to that? Is that how they get introduced? Or the NPC is just interesting to start with. In the Deadlands, there's a person named Martha Dale, and they're just interesting. They're a scientist. They come down. They're going to hire the party. The question is, of course, why are they hiring a party? And I had an adventure where they found a crashed, and this was not in the plot point, but they had to find a crashed Hellstrom Industries ship. They helped the survivors. They killed some monsters. And Martha came down to collect the samples or whatever that were in that ship. And she met them. And she saw what they could do. And there was a reason then she reached out and requested their help. Then I look for things that maybe don't make sense. And even the Lost Colony, which is a great plot point campaign, there were some things that were just, how does that jive with the way the player's motivation, the way they think? And maybe it doesn't make sense, or I need to tweak that. So I look for those opportunities. And I mention it again. I'll mention it. I mentioned it before, and I'll mention it again. The characters have backstories, and they want to explore those backstories, and that may be a subplot, or that might be something that drives them to the main plot. For example, in the Lost Colony, a couple of folks wanted to build a vehicle to do trading. They didn't want to use horse and wagon. They wanted to use this vehicle to do everything. Very, very cool idea. Their desire to fix that vehicle gave them another incentive to work with Martha, because she had resources on the station that she could bring down and help them fix this vehicle. Now they've got a big motivator other than money, and it works off their backstory. The final thing is, don't get so into the plot point campaign that you have to railroad people to make it happen. The whole point is to have a good time, to explore characters, to explore the world. And if they go off into left field and you have some idea on how to make things interesting over there, and maybe they would have just wanted to go after the skinnies right away, and try to figure out how to take them out, learn some stuff completely separate from the plot point campaign. But I could take that piece of the plot point, bring it in, and then if I can pull them into kind of the main story at some point where the skinny is important, when they get there, they'll find out that the skinny's not as important, and it's easy to kill them. It's easy to take them out of the fight because they did something else that was completely unrelated to what I was trying to do from the main plot point campaign. So that's kind of it. I don't run them kind of raw, just as they are. I tweak them, I modify them. I look for the way they tie to the characters' backstories. I look for the connective tissue that I can bring to the table, what things would I do differently, but ultimately looking at that end goal because it's super creative. The whole story arc that's in Lost Colonies is super creative, world changing, all that sort of thing. And I wanted to see how that progressed, and I wanted to see how the players worked in that environment. So in the end, our campaign's going fabulous. And I'd say, again, 50% of it is all original content, all reacting to the players, all taking their backstories and making an interesting story because of that. Well, so anyway, those are some of my ideas on plot point campaigns. Maybe you've got your own. Leave some comments. How do you do them? What is your prep? And look at the bubbles. Do the stuff. Again, I'm Carl with Tabletop Tango, and I appreciate you watching. Appreciate all your support. And thanks. We'll see you next time.
It's a sad